Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is your recording for Lesson 2-5, Solving Absolute Value Equations. Hopefully all the solving equations is going well. We've done one step, we've done two step, we have had variables on both sides. You've written your own equations to solve. Today we're going to introduce something called absolute value. So the absolute value is a number's distance away from zero. Okay, a number's distance away from zero. So for example, if I draw myself a number line here and I put a 0 in the middle, and I say, how far is 10 away from 0? You would tell me that is 10 spaces away from 0. If I put a -6 on here and ask you, how far is -6 away from 0? You would tell me it is 6 units away from 0. This distance cannot be negative. You can't ever have negative miles or negative inches or what have you. So the absolute value will always be positive. And the way that we identify that is with some vertical bars. So for example, that means the absolute value of 10. So how far is 10 away from 0? It is 10 away from 0. This would be the absolute value of -6. Those vertical bars designate the absolute value, and the absolute value of -6 is 6. How about the absolute value of 2? Well, it's just 2. Absolute value of -3/4. How far is -3/4 away from 0? It is 3/4 away from 0. When you are calculating these things and following the order of operations, you still must follow the order of operations. You're kind of going to treat this absolute value like a set of parentheses. Okay, so let's go ahead and try some. It says evaluate if, and you see up top there, I give you the value of f, the value of g, and the value of h. So we're going to use those values in these problems to calculate some values. So if you take a look at number 1, you should notice those vertical bars. Okay, there's vertical bars there. That designates absolute value. You also should notice the h in there, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in that h is 5. So it looks like that. Now, like I said earlier, in the order of operations, we're going to treat those absolute values like parentheses. So in this case, we will do them first. 3 minus 5 is -2. Please notice that the absolute value bars are still around there. Now I'm going to do the absolute value of -2. Well, the absolute value of -2 is 2. Since I took the absolute value, those bars are now gone. And then my final answer here would be 15. Okay, so kind of treat them like parentheses. If we look at number 2 here, again, you can see these vertical bars that designate the absolute value. We're going to go ahead and plug in g, which is supposed to be -4. So it looks like that. In the order of operations, I'm going to do what's inside of that first. -4 plus 9 is 5. So it looks something like that. Now I'm going to actually take the absolute value of 5 with those vertical bars, and I do get 5. Please notice that minus sign gets dropped down. It's on the outside of the absolute value, and 16 minus 5 is then 11. All right, so in this next one, you can see we have lots of variables to plug in. Here are my absolute value bars. F is 3. G is -4. I'm just putting parentheses around that -4, so the plus minus is not directly next to each other, and we have a -5 on the end. So in the order of operations, we treat the absolute value like parentheses. We'll go ahead and do 3 plus -4, which is -1. I have not taken the absolute value yet, so that's why those bars are still around there. The absolute value of -1 is 1, and then -5, and my answer is -4. So you'll notice here I have a negative answer, which is just fine, because the absolute value is not around the entire problem. It's only around part of a problem. Okay, so we still can get negative answers. It's just when you take the absolute value of a number, it is always positive because distance cannot be positive or I'm sorry, distance cannot be negative. Okay, so how do we apply this to an equation? So absolute value equations. Basically, you all know that an equation has an equal sign. So these things will have absolute value bars and an equal sign. If I ask you, what is the solution to this equation here? Okay, what values of x will make that be 10? What values of x will make that be 10? Well, I'm hoping you can tell me that x could be 10. Okay, absolute value of 10 would be 10. So if I put a 10 in there for x, that would work. I'm also hoping you could tell me that I could put negative 10 in there for x, and that would work. All right, moving over here to the middle problem. What value for x can I plug in there so that the absolute value of that thing will be 10? Well, if I put a 9 in there, 9 plus 1 would be 10. Okay. There also is another value that I could put in there. If I put in a negative 11 in there, negative 11 plus 1 is negative 10, then the absolute value of negative 10 is positive 10. And moving over here to the right-hand side, values for x that will make that be 10. So if I put a 5 in there, 2 times 5 is 10. Absolute value of 10 is 10. I also could put a negative 5 in there because that would make it negative 10. And then when I do take that absolute value, I would get 10. So I hope what you're noticing here is that there's two answers, first of all, to all of these equations, these absolute value equations. And I hope you're noticing that I'm trying to make this number on the end. Positive 10 is super easy for us to make, but it also could be equal to negative 10 because when I take the absolute value, the negative is removed and it turns into that positive 10. So basically, I'm going to be setting up a positive and, keyword there being and, negative version of each equation. And that's how we're going to get our two answers. We're going to have two equations that have to be solved, a positive version and a negative version. Now, that doesn't mean that I have to have a positive answer and a negative answer, okay? But I am going to set up two different versions to get my two answers that will work. So let's take a look at a couple here. So number one, we see h plus 7, that's inside the absolute value, is equal to 5. So either h plus 7 can be equal to 5, and that'll work out perfect. Or I can have h plus 7 is equal to negative 5, because when I take the absolute value of that negative 5, I would get the regular 5 back again. So these are my two equations. If I solve them both, nice little one-step equations here, I get my two answers. Okay, so if I need to convince you that these will actually work, I can take these and I can plug them in. So that's what the first one would look like. And that's what the second one would look like. Well, here I get the absolute value of 5 is equal to 5. Well, of course it is, because the absolute value of 5 is 5. Over here, I get a negative 5 inside the absolute value, and you know that from today that if I take the absolute value of negative 5, it is 5. So both of those answers work. They plug in, they check out perfect. Those are my two answers for that equation. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing over here. Either b plus 4 can be equal to 2, or b plus 4 can be equal to negative 2. So I have a positive version and a negative version here because there's two answers to every absolute value equation. If I go ahead and solve this, those are my two answers. Again, you can plug those back in and you can see that they work. On the left-hand side, it would look like this. And in my right-hand equation, it would look like that. So negative, should be a positive 2. Negative 2 plus 4 is 2, and the absolute value of 2 is 2. Negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2, and the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. So both of those do work. Moving on, same kind of idea here. We have the absolute value equal to 9, so either this can be equal to positive 9 or this can be equal to negative 9. And now we have a multi-step equation to solve. Remember, we start farthest away from the z on the same side, so the first thing I got rid of there is that 3. My answer is 4. Again, we are going to get rid of this 3. And then divide, and you should get negative 2. Go ahead and take a look at number 4. Closely take a look at number 4. Because if you notice here, I have the absolute value of 4n minus 1 is equal to negative 6. Now, I hope that's a little bit alarming to you because I have the absolute value of something is equal to negative 6. So that is saying the distance away from 0 of something is equal to negative 6. And that should be red flagging you because distance cannot be negative. So there is nothing to do here. I can never have an absolute value that's equal to a negative. Okay, there is no solution to this equation because anytime I take these absolute value bars and apply them to something, it makes it positive. Okay, so there is no solution to that equation. Number 5 looks okay, so we'll go ahead and set that up. And we'll solve. And I get my 2 answers. Okay, 4 and negative 3. Again, number 6 here looks okay. We will go ahead and set up the positive version of this equation and the negative version of this equation. And those would be my 2 answers. Remember, you can always check these folks by going ahead and plugging those in back into the original problem. All right, last one here. We take a look at number 7. And again, I hope this is red flagging you because there's no way that I can take the absolute value of this whole side and have it be equal to a negative 8. There is no way that distance can be negative 8. Again, those absolute value bars turn things positive. That entire left-hand side of that equation has an absolute value bar around it, so that whole thing would have to be positive. This thing has no solution. Okay, and that's the symbol for no solution, that little circle with a line through it. You also could write out no solution. All right, folks, go ahead and complete your notes check for me, and we will see you tomorrow.